Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Am I audible? Okay. So today we discuss paper 1 of sociology. So if we have to do analysis of the paper, mostly the question was on the easier side, right? Moderate to difficult were 3-4 questions. Mostly were from previous year questions which were repeated, easy and direct questions. In paper 1, around 4 to 5 questions, you can say moderate to difficult, which needed application based questions were there. Rest were very easy. So first we will try to understand how do you write answer in sociology paper. So when it comes to writing answer, first thing you have to remember is that you read question carefully. Answer what is asked, not what you know. You know a lot of things about common sense, but you have to see what they're asking in the question. They're saying what is common sense, how are common knowledge or common sense and sociology related. So you cannot start your answer with telling differences between common sense and knowledge, sociology. That is not asked. Very directly they have written how they are related to each other. What is the relationship? What is the similarity? What is the overlap here? So reading the question carefully is very important. Try to see what are they asking. And what is the main demand of question? For which part my maximum words will be used. This you have to keep in mind. Secondly, you have to see, does the question has different parts? Like this question has 2 parts. What is common sense? And how common sense and sociology are related to each other. So there are 2 things in this question. And the question is of 150 words. If 10 words go for introduction, 10 for conclusion, it means 130 words are there. And even if you do 50-50% for both the parts or 60-40, probably you'll write more for this. So if you're doing 50-50, you have around 65 words for each part. So you have to use words judiciously. This is very important. If you are going beyond the word limit, first of all, you won't be able to complete exam because you have to write 5 short notes, 2 20 markers, 4 20 markers and 2 10 markers. So there are a lot of answers to be written. You don't have much time to waste here. You have to be to the point. Very crisp and concise points have to be there. You cannot write big paragraphs for everything. Use tables, use diagrams wherever possible. So write words, write your answer within your word limit. When you're practicing at home, try to see with your font size and how much space you leave between paragraphs till which page your 150 words are covered or 250 are covered. Just count them. So that while you are writing, obviously you don't have time to count words. You know that when I am on 1.5 page, my 150 words are almost over now. Now I have to wrap up the answer. so that you have an idea till when you can write, and after that you have to quickly wrap up. You can't go beyond it. You will cross the word limit. Right? Then, second thing is structure of answer is very important. You should have a clarity if they're asking. There's one question in the paper, historical materialism. Second is its relevance in contemporary society. So first, you have to divide answer in two parts, and then when you are writing relevance, it should be related to this. Whatever features of historical materialism you have written, economic base, superstructure, infrastructure. Similarly here, relevance should be related to it. There has to be a proper structure and a proper flow. It's not that you are writing historical materialism, in between you are writing relevance part. Again you are writing a feature, then again. Divide the answer, segregate the answer. Make it clear. Clarity should be there in your answer. Without clarity, you will not get marks. And this is an easy question. Everybody will be having content for this. Right? There's one question on Merton, where his reference group theory they have asked to explain from a digital identity point of view. Now that is a question where people might not have good content. But there also good structure is required, but there you can score marks with content also. But here, when content is same for every person, your difference will come with the structure, how well organized your content is, how clear your content is. Your answer should be such that examiner should not flip the back page that okay, what he is saying or she is saying, I'm not able to understand, so he has to read your answer again to make sense. That should not happen. Structure is very, very important. Make use of subheadings. Make use of diagrams, flowcharts. In body of the answer. Always write a balanced answer. If they're asking what is the relevance of his theory, last 2-3 lines you can add how it is no longer relevant. Contemporary society, historical materialism is not that relevant, and then you conclude it. And despite its criticism, for a larger part, this theory is still relevant for the society. So always write a balanced thing. It's not that Marx's theory of historical materialism is relevant, fully 100% relevant. It is not. There are certain criticism also, and that also you have to include in your answer. So always aim for a balanced answer. They're asking, not asking doesn't matter. If they're explicitly asking, then obviously you have to write down. In case they're not asking directly the criticism, still one line or 2-3 points, very briefly, very short, you have to discuss the other side of the argument. And then lastly, conclusion. Summarize the answer. Right? Now, how do I do the conclusion? Either I tell that, okay, despite criticism, this particular ABC theory added to sociological knowledge or to understand whatever the concept is. You can write in this way. Or you can write about modern day relevance. Or you can just summarize what you have written in one line. Your choice. But don't leave answer open-ended. right? That's a wrong approach when you're writing answers. Do a proper ending to your answer, right? Okay, so now let's just see first question. We'll try to understand the structure through this question, and then other questions we'll try to see first the unconventional question or moderate to difficult questions which came about, and rest we'll just discuss the structure. So now first question, what is common sense? So when you're writing the introduction, define. You can give definition by Max Weber, you can give definition by Alfred Schutz. In this class, focus on how to arrange the content, how to structure your content. In few days, the entire key I will share on my channel. Content, see, again and again I say, content will never be a problem. In today's world, content is not a problem. How do you present your content is more important, right? So, you define either by Max Weber's definition or Alfred Schutz definition of common sense. That will be your introduction. So, introduction mostly try to do it through a proper thinker given definition. If the question is about religion, give definition of religion. You can quote Durkheim. If it is about social change, give Horton and Hunt, McLever and Page. Both of them have given definition of social change. If the question is by alienation, proper definition as given by Marx should be added in your answer. And if you remember where the term was defined, in which book or in which work Marx or Durkheim defined that also you can add, right? Next is, they're asking what is common sense. So very quickly write down the features of common sense, that it is based on personal or group experiences, it is based on assumptions, it is unreflective in nature. So basic features of common sense you have to explore in this part. And in fact, because it's a 150 word, even this much elaboration about common sense will be more than enough. You have to describe common sense first. This definition is not enough, right? Because question is specifically saying what is common sense. If the question would have been just that explore the relationship between common sense and sociology, then it's not necessary to describe what is common sense. There probably, even if you drew a diagram or you even didn't describe about common sense, that would have been okay. But now here specifically they're asking what is common sense. Definition is not enough. You will give the features of common sense. Then after that, you'll come on the second part. What is the relationship between sociology and common sense? How they are related to each other. Now in this question also, at the end or in the conclusion, you can write down that there are some overlapping areas, but still they are very distinct from each other. Their study, the subject matter, the research method, the certified body of knowledge, which is sociology, it is very different from common sense, even when there is some kind of overlap between two. So this will give the counter argument about the relationship. So here you can start by writing that common sense and sociology are both ways of studying society. Both tell things about society. Common sense will also tell you that marriage is important. But why is marriage important? Why was the institution of marriage created? Why marriage as an institution still functions in this society? Questions, deeper analysis is done by sociology. They don't take it on the face of it. Most of the people, in the society, they marry because they are of marriageable age. Why do people marry? Why it is important for human beings to marry to someone? These deeper questions, sociology discusses. Common sense doesn't. Common sense comes from assumption, from culture, taken for granted things, which we feel is right only. There is no reflection on it, right? So you write down, they both study society, but they differ in depth. To which depth they are covering a particular aspect of society. What is the focus? What is the method they are using? Common sense doesn't have any method. It is just passed on from generation to generation. Or from your experience you gather some common sense. There is no methodology. It's not a certified body of knowledge like sociology. Then we can write down nevertheless. They do share a relationship. So here in this question, at first, in one line, differences have been given. It's more than sufficient to give a counter argument. You can write at the end also, but here it is written at the start. And then you tell about the relationship. Both common sense and sociology, they share the same starting point. Social interactions. Both are concerned about the same thing. Sociology refines and deepens what common sense already knows. Common sense knows marriage is important. And now it provides a starting point for sociology to further study why, how, where, when. Answer all these questions. Right? Then sociology transforms lived wisdom into analytical knowledge. The wisdom of the society is converted into analytical thing. It is converted into a general theory which is applicable not to the society here but everywhere around the world, that particular knowledge is valid in nature. Right? Then you can add thinker's perspective. Anthony Giddens says sociological knowledge over the time becomes the part of common sense. Then when we talk about non-positivist methodologies like phenomenology, ethnomethodology, they make use of commonsensical knowledge. They talk about typifications, right? The strict separation of common sense and sociology was done only by a positivist who wanted sociology only to be objective, fact-oriented in nature. But there are certain branches which make use of this common sense knowledge, which try to see the individual experiences, like phenomenology. So there is a connection between common sense and sociology. Then you conclude the answer. And you don't need to write this whole table. Just one line of each perspective would be more than enough. Conclusion will be, thus, common sense and sociology are not entirely opposed, but sociology often refines, deepens, and sometimes rejects common sense also. Sometimes common sense is wrong also. So, sociology tries to prove it right or wrong. So, if this is just one line conclusion and your answer is done. You don't need big paragraphs. You don't need large elaborations. Just crisp and concise points. Cover everything possible. Include 1-2 thinkers, and see, one thing you should remember, you don't need thinkers for each and every point. That is a myth. Please don't overload your answers with thinkers. That's a wrong approach. Your answer should be a mix of analysis and thinkers' point of view, examples, case studies. And even if you don't have specific name of any thinker, write down from Marxist conflict perspective, from feminist perspective, from functionalist perspective. You can use like this also, because you know the basic criteria behind every perspective. So even if you don't know the specific thinker, you can write like this. And also, examiner doesn't expect that if you are writing 10 points, 10 thinkers should be there. 1 or 2 are more than sufficient. Focus on sociological language. So avoid the definition that marriage is a social union of marriage is a union of two people. This is a layman definition. Write down a proper definition given by a thinker or use sociological word. That marriage is a social institution which gives cultural sanction to union of two people. Now this is sociological. Social institution has come, cultural sanction has come as a word. And it leads to legitimization of progeny. But this is sociological language. So usage of sociological words like patriarchy, relative deprivation, reference group, self-identity, alienation, anomie, rapid social change, all the words which are given in your syllabus in simple terms. If you are using it in your point, it is more than sufficient. You don't need overloading of thinkers. Don't overload yourself. You forget it. Even say for poverty, you are remembering 10 thinkers. At the end, you will just remember 1 or 2 only. So why not start with 1 or 2 thinkers only? So don't worry too much about thinkers. But the answer should have a sociological point of view. If it is talking about informal sector, it should be in a proper parameters of sociology. You're talking about social mobility, you're talking about the gender question, you're talking about kinship relation. When, if you've not done paper 2, in the informal sector, we will talk about how jobs in your informal sectors are related to your kinship relations. One person from a village gets a job, then he calls all his village members, he refers them. And in the informal sector, usually a kinship network, caste network develops even in the urban areas. So now this is a sociological, not telling 98% of India's economy is informal sector. That's a statistic. That is not a sociological analysis. Sociological analysis is when you see it from different perspective, from stratification point of view. Who is most in the informal sector? Women. Because it's a low paying job, easy hire and fire. Timings are comfortable in nature, so they can balance gender role in the work and outside also. So this, even if you're not using thinkers also, still this answer is sociological in nature. And if you have not watched, there is a video which is there on the YouTube about the framework which we need to use, mnemonics and frameworks. Just go to R.C. Reddy's YouTube channel, you'll find that. How to make your answer sociologically relevant, even without thinkers, when you even don't have any thinker. If the question is about sex ratio, obviously there are 2-3 thinkers. Even if you forget about these thinkers, even if you write terms like sun preference, sun meta preference, or you write about how women in a patriarchal society, they are financial and security wise their obligations, you will get marks. If you have a little bit concept of Pitradhan in Hinduism, that necessitates having a son. All the ritual, all the pujas are done by the male member. So these concepts, even without thinkers, if you remember thinkers, very good. 1 or 2 thinkers about each and every topic. But in case you don't remember, don't panic. Focus on writing a sociological answer. Focus on writing sociological terms and jargons. Include case studies. Case studies are very important for paper 2. Tomorrow we'll discuss paper 2. Right? Anyhow, coming back. So it's all about how sociologically relevant your answer is. And also how you are giving your own perspective also, not just what ABC thinker said or what different thinkers are talking about it. Okay, next, what is the relationship between, and they have in brackets written, similarities and differences between sociology and history in terms of area of study and methodology. Right? Now, in this question, in introduction, you first define what do you mean by sociology and what do you mean by history. Give their definition, or you can add quotes also. There are certain quotes which are given by thinkers. If you go back to my channel, there is first chapter is shared there. So there you will find out a quote. I'll just tell you the quote. So there is a thinker by the name of, there's a person, G.H. Howard. So G.H. Howard says that history is past sociology and sociology is present history, establishing a connection between the two. So you can start with his quote also, your wish. Either you start with definition of both, what is sociology, scientific study of social structure, institution, relationship processes, and history is the descriptive subject about the events in the past. Or you can start with this. This is a better option because at the start only you gave a thinker's point of view. It creates a good impression. Now next is, you have to discuss about diverging areas. Now when we are talking about differences, I'm just giving you a common structure. When it is about differences between sociology and any social science, there are certain parameters which you can discuss. What is the core focus of a particular subject? What is the scope? Scope is boundary. Right? Then, what is the research method? Right? Then, you can write about theory development. These are some common parameters. Application. You can write if you want. So at least these parameters will be common when you are discussing difference between any social science, sociology and history, political science, any kind of differences you are discussing, you should remember points along these lines. Now the question is about area of study and methodology. So the question has already pointed out that I need differences along these two lines. You don't need to describe everything when it is talking about history and sociology. So now how to create differences? When you are talking about area of study, here you break up into what is the core focus. Core focus in sociology is modern society. What is the core focus in history? Past society. History is always about past. Then the area of study, when we are talking about, it is analytical in nature. This is just description of events. So the area of study of sociology limits itself to analysis, not just description that family is present, marriage is present. History is descriptive. It will just give you dates. It will just talk about events. And now with each point, you can give an example. That sociology will try to study marriage system in India, present system, what is happening. History will just describe probably marriage alliances, just describes marriage alliance between Mughals and Rajputs. It's not going into the detail that why this happened, what was the structure of family system, how many wives used to be there, what was the gender role. History is not concerned about that, right? Then you come on methodology. So although they asked 2 points, within this point we covered 2 more sub-points. Methodology. For your history, for your sociology, there are two methods. Here, quantitative and qualitative both. For history, only quantitative methods are required, right? Then when we are talking about sociology, because of its, its history, its methods are more reliable as well as valid. History, you're not really sure about the authenticity, right? Even if we have the best methodology, it is not able to prove that this event happened. So these points, you have to make sure that you tell the differences. But then you talk about the similarities also, that there is an overlap. That even though sociology studies present societies, but it still sees the overall change. It tries to see the social change also with respect to how society has developed. When it studies religion, it sees the past religions. If it is studying about any economic system, it tries to see the past also. Right? History, your sociology makes use of your secondary sources like autobiographies, accounts of history as a source of collecting data also. Secondary sources you might be knowing in research methods you might have covered. So there is a difference also, there is a similarity also in both of them. But there is scope, there are boundaries, the way which they are studying, what answers they are giving, that differs in both of them, right? And then at the end you will conclude the answer, just summarize it. That even though there are differences, but still both of them add to each other. You can even give example of how Marx has given stages of society, where he talks about previous historical stages also. When Durkheim talks about mechanical solidarity, he's talking about past societies. So there is an overlap also with the theories which sociology has and what is there in the history. Sociology picks up certain content from the historical part, right? So this was your second question. Now next is variable. What are variables? So see, variable question, very direct, very simple. You can just refer it from the answer key which I will be sharing. Just one thing I have to show you here. Just 1 second. Anyhow, so when you are writing about variables, in introduction you define. There are 2-3 thinkers who have defined variable. You can choose any one definition. Then, in the body of the answer, you start by describing the types of variables. There are direct variables, indirect variables, dependent variable, independent variable. Right? Explain little bit that you manipulate independent variable and see the changes in dependent variable. So there are quantitative and qualitative variables also. So this will describe what are variables apart from what is the definition. And second part is what is the importance in sociological research. Right? So you list down 3-4, it leads to formation of your hypothesis, test the theory, right? It can lead to establishing cause and effect in the social research. So all the usage of your research with examples, right? You can use any to say, for example, you can give, right, say poverty and illiteracy. Illiteracy will be an independent variable. If you manipulate it, you can make a hypothesis that once illiteracy increases, poverty also increases. When illiteracy decreases, poverty also decreases. So this is the use of variables. You manipulate them, and through the manipulation, you can come to a hypothesis, you can test a theory, and you can also find out cause and effect of something. So this will complete your answer. This is an easy question, very direct question. There will be no teacher who will not cover about variables and its usage. Very simple in nature. Then next question was applied. Now this I would say not difficult but moderate level of question is there, moderate level of difficulty is there. So the question is, can Merton's reference group theory be relevant in understanding identity making in your digital world? What is the reference group theory? Yes, anyone? What is the reference group theory? Yes, anyone? Reference group. What is reference group? A group through which you evaluate your position, your goals, your ambitions, your place in the society. Right? You take it as a reference point, basically. Right? So, there are different groups in the society and you evaluate yourself. On the basis of these groups, your goals, your achievements, your position, your success, etc. Now the question is that how the Merton's reference group theory can be useful in studying the digital, in understanding identity making in digital world. So in the social media, how his theory can be relevant. So now we know that Merton divides the reference group into positive reference group, negative reference group, comparative, membership reference group, non-membership reference group. It talks about the concept of anticipatory socialization. Then comparative and normative reference group. Now the thing is, when such applied based question comes, don't panic. That they have not asked directly what is reference group theory. They have asked you that how you develop yourself, your self-identity, who you are, through reference group who you come across on social media or digital world. So first, break down what is the theory. Theory, he gives different types. Now connect it with your identity with reference to these positive groups. Say for example, for some person, self-identity, right? Say for example that I am a person who is a fashionista, who likes fashion. This identity develops when he or she sees the fashion influencers. On your digital media, on the social media, that's a positive reference group, and through which you form an identity of yourself. That if I'll dress up like her, if I'll buy clothes like her, I will become a fashionista. I develop a self-identity that I am a person who is interested in fashion. Or you come across a financial influencer that if I will follow his advice, I will invest in stock market, I will be a person who is financially literate. I want to be a person who is rich, who is financially aware. So the reference group which you see on digital media, it helps you to develop that self-identity. Who am I? What do I want? What is my personality per se? How do I see myself? And this identity is developed when I see different reference group that I want to be like this, I want to be like this, or even negative in nature. That this probably there's a on social media you see certain groups performing some pranks or doing deadly things on railway tracks or something, or a dance video is there. You don't want to do that. You will say that I will never be like them. These are not my role models. This is a negative reference group for me. So this forms my identity that I'll never be cringe like them. I'll never do these things. So social media, on your digital media, there are a lot of reference groups, positive, negative, membership groups. For you, a membership group or probably for anticipatory socialization might be a person who is an officer. You see his reels, you see his videos, and he says that I studied for 10 hours. I studied this particular book. Now you form your identity that if I want to be successful in this exam, my personality, my self-identity is a person who is very hardworking, who doesn't attend family functions, because this person is also doing the same thing. So, say for example, this is one person A, and this is the reference group which he sees on social media. Because question is specifically asking about digital media. It's not about any reference group. Specifically they have given how this person forms his self-identity by seeing the reference group. You have to discuss that. So for all these points, you will give examples and explain how digital media through reference groups helps you form your self-identity. Simple answer. So whenever there is a question, applied question, application-based question. Like few years back, there was a question that explain corruption through manifest and latent function. Don't get panicked. I don't know this. I just first see what is manifest, what is latent. Manifest is what is visible in nature. Intended consequence. What is the intended consequence of corruption? Your work gets done very fast. It's a manifest function. What is a latent hidden function? Unintended consequence. You get social mobility. Right? When you get money, accumulation of wealth is a obvious function of corruption, that you get more money. But latent is you get social mobility also. So don't get worried when you see application-based question. Just remember the theory. Just remember the parts of the theory and then relate it with keywords which they are asking in the question. Simple. There is no rocket science here. Even this question, I didn't say it is difficult. It is very moderate in nature. In fact, you can give ample amount of examples here. There are so many reference groups on digital media. Right? Yes, are we clear here? Can you write down this answer? Okay, moving forward. Next question was, is social stratification theory gender blind? Can any one of you think about this question? How do you answer it? Take 1 minute. right? Just whatever comes to your mind, the question is social stratification theory gender blind? Elucidate. Try to think 1 minute. Your register is in front of you. Even if your register is not with you, just think about it. That if I have to write this answer, introduction will be definition of social stratification. Now in the body of the answer, I have to write whether social stratification is gender blind. So how can you divide this answer? Which points you can include in this answer? Think about it. Take just 2 minutes something. Yes. Is social stratification theory blind? Gender blind? Okay, what are the different theories of social stratification? Anyone? Which are the thinkers who have given it? Yes? Anyone? Marx theory of stratification, Weber's theory of stratification, Davis and Moore's functional theory, Parsons' theory, right? Now these are certain social stratification theory. Now the question is it gender blind? Yes. Marx never talks about women. It just talks about bourgeoisie and proletariat. There is no question of gender here. It doesn't divide it into that there is a female bourgeoisie class or female proletariat, male proletariat. For him, there is a working class, there is a capitalist class, which is gender neutral. He never brings up the question of females or any question. He doesn't segregate them. This is a female worker. He feels it will be same. Alienation will be same for females also, males also. But he forgets that in females, alienation might be more higher. She is working at home also. She is working in factories also. Similarly, Weber expands his theory from class to status and party. But again, he never talks about the women separately. So this means major theories, functionalist theories, Davis and Moore also don't talk about it. They talk about role allocation, talent search. They never talk about women or the concept of gender and stratification. So one part of your first part of your answer will be yes, it is gender blind. It never takes up the question of gender. So see, questions are easy. They're not asking something, you cannot say this is out of syllabus. They are testing your analytical powers. Break down the question. Is the social stratification theory? So your first question to yourself should be which theories? Functionalist, Marxist, Weberian theory. Right? These are the major theories. Now, are they gender blind? What does gender blind means? That they are not. Are they talking about the question of gender? If not, it means they are blind with respect to gender. They close their eyes. That it's not important. When I'm talking about Marxism, when I'm talking about working class, it is all the working class. I'm not talking about the gender. Right? So, this perspective, or you see, tomorrow the question comes in paper 2. That whether Marx class theory is relevant in India or not. At some level it is, but at some level it's not, because it doesn't take up the question of caste. Caste is a very important equation, so you cannot understand stratification in India without talking about caste. It's an incomplete theory to study Indian society. So it's caste blind. So you break down the question. Ask yourself question. Even in the last question, Merton's reference theory, break down what is reference theory? What are the different types of reference group? And then are they relevant in understanding identity making in digital worlds? See what are the reference groups in digital world and how do they develop your identity? Break down the question. In your mind, make a mental map. No question There's no question, not a single question in this paper I would say which is not doable in nature. You just need analytical power in some questions. 80% questions are direct. What is historical materialism? What is common sense? What is positivism? This is direct. Where will the difference come? With a person who is getting 230 marks and a person who is getting 290 or 300 in these questions. Easy question, everybody attempts. And these questions are also not difficult. Once you understand the question's demand, it's easy to write. Now, first part you will write, yes, it's gender blind. Then you will write down, there was coming up a feminist theorist who talk about the gender aspect of social stratification. Even in Marxism, there were feminist Marxists which emerged, which talked about that capitalism benefits from patriarchy. So they included the gender aspect later on. There were a lot of feminist theorists like Shula Smith-Pherson, Sylvia Wolby. All of these people talked about patriarchal system, gender inequalities, and the social stratification system resulting out of that. So, two parts of the question. Yes, the traditional theories were gender blind. They never addressed the question of gender. The second part is later on there were improvements. New methodologies emerged in sociology which took up the question of gender in the stratification system. Now what will be the conclusion? Conclusion will be combining both things, that now it's not just class or gender, because if you do only gender, that is also incomplete. Now the stratification theories are based on intersectionality. We study about social stratification, we study about inequality in society based on intersectionality. Not just one aspect, that I am a woman. I'll see what is my class, what is my caste, what is the intersection of inequality which I face. So if a particular woman is low caste, low class, she will have lowermost position in the social hierarchy. Upper caste, middle class women will have a different place. Upper caste, upper class women will have different place. So now the way we study social stratification is based on intersectionality, not just one criteria, class, status, etc. Combining all these things. That will be your conclusion, where you talk about intersectionality in one line, and that completes your answer. So even this answer is not difficult, but still because it's not direct in nature, people get confused that what is the gender blind. If tomorrow they say Marx theory is caste blind, yes it is. And that is why later on, very later in his work, Marx included a concept, Asiatic mode of production. That Indian society's economic development cannot fit in this primitive communism, slavery, feudalism. So he gave another mode, Asiatic mode of production. That was a way to include the different criteria in Indian society. Right? So read the question carefully. That is why I started the lecture from here. Reading the question carefully means half of your battle is won. Don't just superficially sift through the question. There is a scientifically proven fact that human minds don't read a word completely. Say for example, if I have written here features, over the time, the mind is such that it will just read first letter and last letter. Even if in between I interchange the words, you will still read it features. Don't read your question like this. That you pick up 2-3 words and start writing it. Read it word by word. Try to see what exactly they are asking. Are they asking differences? Are they asking similarities? Are they asking relevance? Are they asking features? Because if you are not writing them, what is being asked, you'll get a 0. They don't care that you have written about, if some student writes theories of social stratification, he'll get a 0. Question is not what are different theories of social stratification. Question is whether it is gender blind or not. So your articulation of your sentences, articulation means formation of your sentence should be such where you elucidate to the examiner that yes, this is gender blind, and another part, no, it is not gender blind. Right? Yes, are we clear here? Any doubt? Yes? Okay. Next is positivism. See, this is a very simple question. Direct question. What is positivism? Critically analyze major arguments against. Simplest of question. There can be no question which is more simple and direct than this. I'll just show you. So you can start by just defining what is positivism. Give a proper definition. Now this definition is taken from IGNOU. Don't just write positivism as scientific study of society, usage of science. Write the proper, full definition. It's a pioneer theoretical strand in sociology where science was very popular and sociology also wanted to have the same prestige as science. So it started using the scientific method at the start because it wanted to do a scientific study of society. So major definition, the specific definition should be there. Then you quickly write down the salient features of positivism. Right? Now when you're writing arguments against it, you can write first of all general criticism, right? That it focuses too much on objectivity, overemphasis on objectivity, ignores subjective meanings of factors. It overemphasizes on quantifying something, forming general theories, and totally forgets that humans are not static, they're not lab specimen from where you get facts. They have feelings, they have motives. That also needs to be covered. Then you do a specific criticism. Criticism from the point of view of Weber. That positivism forgets about subjective meaning. Criticism from the aspect of symbolic interactionism, from the perspective of Fino, from the perspective of ethnomethodology. Right? So this will be apart from the general features. In 2017, there was a question on positivism only. What is positivism? Discuss its critique from the point of view of phenomenology and ethnomethodology. So question remains the same. They'll just repackage it. In this, they have asked all the arguments against it. There we had to focus just on these two perspectives. These are all non-positivist methodologies. And they have criticized positivism. Right? So easy question, low-hanging fruit. You should not be going wrong in these questions. If you're going wrong, if you're writing how big question, generic layman answers in this, then you're already out of the race. Because the person who is aiming for 300, he will write a best answer on positivism. Because it's very simple. If you're fumbling in your basic questions, then what to expect in the application-based questions, right? Okay, anyhow, coming back. So now, till now, if we see, if we try to classify, this is a static question, this is a static question, this is a static question, this is a applied question, this is a static but analytical in nature, not descriptive, right? Then, again, positivism, static question, static question. This is also a static question. Half of your paper is static. Barring 3-4 questions, all of the paper is static, right? So it depends upon your writing skills, on your memory skills, how well you can remember definitions. So positivism question in this room, if you are giving mains, everyone will attempt. Difference of everyone with the topper will come when a person will write a specific definition. Right? So these things you should remember. Now, even next, if you see, this is again a static question. Now, this was little difficult. This I would refer to as a difficult question. Right? But still, you can compare it in a static. The pressure group, again static question. Hypothesis and research method, again static question. Marriage trends is a static question. Marriage chapter, we do the recent trends. Then Mosca, Robert Michaels, Pareto, again a static question. Direct question that just asks you to compare. You just have to draw a table and write what is the definition, what are the features of the theory, what is the application of the theory. That's it. Comparison is done. Right? And so section A, 90% is static. Even not 90, even more than 90%, because there is only one Merton's question, which is application based. So scoring in sociology is easiest. Even if you are a first timer and you have not done much of your preparation, still you can score 220 to 230 very easily, even with basic superficial knowledge, because paper is so simple. If you even have bare minimum knowledge, you will score 220 to 230. But the problem is the jump from here to 290 to 300. That is difficult. This jump is very difficult. This will require specific knowledge. This will require specific definitions. This will require integration of current affairs. This will require case studies in your answer, and most importantly, right structure in your answer. These things you should remember. See, key answers to these questions, you go online, you will get 10 different websites giving answer to this. Your key to getting 300 is not reading the answer. Key is understanding that when next time a question comes, how do I analyze it? I have not read this question before. How do I attempt this question? That is the art of writing answers. So even if you go through the answer key, even if you learn all the answers, it serves no purpose at all. You have to inculcate in yourself the art of answer writing. The day you get that art of answer writing, learning or memorizing fact is the most easiest thing. You have been doing the memorization part since your kindergarten, right? It's not that difficult. Since your school, college, you have been memorizing. But in UPSC, how you present those memorized facts, how crisp and clear your answer is, that matters the most, right? Okay, coming back here. So, positivism is done. Historical materialism, I think you can attempt definition. Just write down economic infrastructure, progress of society, economic base of society. Relevance is there is still inequality in the society, which Marx, predicted. He said there will be, because this is the capitalist society, you have to refer to the relevance in that manner. That Oxfam report, every year it shows there is difference between the bourgeoisie and proletariat class, right? Then economic base of the society, it is impacting media. You can talk about paid media. You can talk about big business houses controlling media houses, controlling colleges, schools. So yes, there is a economic infrastructure. Then opposite side, you can tell that it is not very relevant in other parts of the society, and then you conclude the answer. So direct static question, right? Okay. Next, reliability also, this is a direct question. Reliability is that if you are proving something, right? that if you are doing any research, test and retest, right, we should produce same results. You do today, so temporal and spatial, same results are there. You do it here, you do it in US. You have theory of family. We will say this theory of family is reliable because you test this today, you test after 10 days. It is relevant. You test in India, you test in US. It is still relevant in nature. So we will say same results over time, over space. So means that is a reliable theory. Reliability and validity topic in your research method chapter is very important, very simple, but direct questions like this come. Include certain examples and give names of certain theories. Talk about how quantitative methods lead to more reliable theories. Right? So simple, direct, static question. Okay, next is, now this is a question which is little difficult. Compare capability deprivation approach. Now, capability deprivation approach is given by Amartya Sen. Which says that poverty is not just lack of money. It is lack of capabilities. You don't have enough education, skills, opportunities are not with you. You don't have much choices. So it's not just lack of money. It is lack of capabilities to function as a well-adjusted member of the society. That is one aspect of poverty. Then next is your social capital deprivation. Social capital concept is given by Pierre Bourdieu, which says social capital is the connections you develop in the society. How many people you know, how many people help you, right? So, more of the social capital, less chances of being poor. Why are Dalit poor? Because they have low social capital. Now you have to compare these two, that a Dalit is not able to uplift himself from poverty, not start his own business and not leave his hereditary job of probably manual scavenger because he doesn't have social capital. On the other hand, a rich person has so many connections. So tomorrow if he wants to start a new factory, he will know the person who sells raw material also, he'll know a person who will be able to get him a license also, he'll know a person who can recruit people also. So for him it's very easy. So social capital theory says that poverty is a result of lack of social connection, lack of social capital in the society, and you have to compare these two theories. Whenever there is a question of comparison, always write in a tabular form. Like this. Right? Or say you are not comfortable with tabular form, what you can do is first describe the capability deprivation theory, right, or approach. Write down its point, what is the core idea, what is the focus, what is the unit of analysis, etc. Now, in the next paragraph, when you will discuss about social capital approach, your points, these subtopics, they should remain same. If I want to compare two students, I have to compare her on same unit, same parameter. I cannot compare her on her marks of sociology and her on the marks of GS1. That is not difference. Difference is always on the basis of same parameter. This you should remember. Any question in optional, any question in your GS, when they ask you to differentiate between two things, two concepts, their points should be having same parameter. If the first point is definition, define both of them. How the definition differ. Features, how the features differ. How the cause of something differ. How the consequence of something differs. How the solutions, both of the concepts have different approach. So any question of difference has to be done with similar parameters. You cannot compare chalk and cheese, apple and oranges. You need to have similar parameters to compare two things, right? So this is, and now if you're doing it in a tabular form or you're doing in this manner, that's your personal choice, whatever you're comfortable with, right? Anyone coming back? So capability deprivation approach, like I was telling, it's not the lack of income but lack of fundamental capabilities, real freedom, opportunities to function as a human. Social capital is poverty seen as lack of social networks, trust and relationship that increases your access to opportunities, resources, right? Then focus is on this social capability approach. The focus is on individual well-being and freedom, what people can do, what people are capable of, improving the capabilities of people here. The focus is on the networks, how to develop the networks. That is why when we talk about self-help groups, it is a program which is based on that we want to increase the social capital of people, that people will gather together, they will have more connections, more networks, or cooperative societies. Cooperative societies, self-help groups, they are a source of poverty elevation. How do they work? They work on this social capital. That once this network, this trust is increased, when you're pooling your money, when you're giving micro loans to the members, it is based on trust. Poverty will be elevated. Like you can give example of Kudumbashree program in Kerala. It is based on the social capital, that once you have a trust, once you have that network, once you have this relationship, it's easier for you to get out of the poverty line. So like this, you try to compare both the sides. What is the unit of analysis? Individual. Here it is community or group level. It's not about one person's social capital. As a community, you have to increase the social capital, right? So try to write down in a tabular form always, or do the differences under similar parameters. If the first point is cause of one particular aspect, for the other topic also, first point should be cause, right? Okay. Then next is, are pressure groups? Again, a simple question, static. Define pressure group, give a sociological definition, there are too many definitions. You can even give classification of pressure group in a diagram, which is given by your Almond and Powell. You can give the classification of pressure group. Then are they a threat to or a necessary element to democracy? So divide the answer into two parts, right? How they are a necessary element of democracy and how they are a threat. When you are writing about threat, include the example of anomic pressure groups which use violence, which use your measures like corruption, lobbying, right? You can here give example. There's an old example. Meera Radia tapes. It was back in 2012 where a pressure group of journalists were caught lobbying for cabinet minister position, that who will become the minister. These type of pressure groups, these are harmful to the democracy. right? But when pressure groups are involved in policy formation, as a feedback mechanism, as a connection of state with the people, right? As a form of connection with the political parties, then it is not a threat to democracy. Give example, give one or two thinkers perspective, your answer is done. Straight static question, easiest question ever, right? This is what is done in the foundation classes. You define pressure group, you see the functions of it, and you also see there are certain dysfunctional pressure groups, right? Okay, next is again easy question. What is hypothesis? When you're discussing about hypothesis, there is a definition by L.A. Lundberg that should be written at the start whenever there is a question about hypothesis. Then significance of hypothesis, and the question is critically evaluate. Now they are directly asked you to evaluate it. So the negative part should also be there. So you first write the positive aspect or its importance. It gives direction to your research. It narrows down the points of study. It helps you decide what will be your research methods. It helps to develop your area of research. It also helps you to tell which your sampling you have to do with respect to research. Then you do the negative part, right? That hypotheses are sometimes not provable. They sometimes take you to a wrong direction. So all these things in the negative aspect you will write down and then you will conclude the answer. Again, direct question, simple question. So now this question, now see, UPSC is also not stupid, they're very sharp. Now what they have done is, this is a 20 marker, this is a 20 marker and this is a 10 marker. Now these two questions are easy. Easiest question which can come. But they will pair it with a difficult question. So now a person who is getting 300 marks, for sure, he will be knowing this question. The difficult question. Because these are cakewalks. Simplest questions. It won't even take time. You will save time in fact. So, if you can choose these questions, because these you have to choose, you have to do any two. If you can choose the best option, where two questions are easy and one is you have, okayish knowledge, it's better to attempt than if you know good knowledge about it, then obviously you will score high. So, choosing your questions is also very important. You try to maximize your marks, and one thing you have to remember, whenever there is a choice, there might be a situation where you know 20 markers very well, but you don't know the 10 marker. It's okay. 10 marker, even if you write the best answer, you will get 5 or 6 marks. But here, if you know these 20 markers very nicely, then attempt this question. But don't compromise with quality of 20 markers. Never compromise. Always do those 20 markers where you are 100% sure that I can write the best answer possible. Right? Choose those questions only. If this is not very well remembered, it's okay. Doesn't matter much. You'll write something obviously. Now next is, what would you identify as similarities and differences in the elite theories of Mosscom, Michaels and Pareto? So now the thing is, similarities, if you're talking about, all of them gave theories with respect to the modern political systems. And all of them believed that there will be concentration of power. There will be a elite rule. Elite rule is inevitable. That all the three people agree. Right? And there will be a elite minority and masses. This is also a similar point of these theories. Right? So now 3 points of similarities. Now when we talk about differences, how do they describe elites? That differs. Pareto sees elites having certain psychological traits, lions and foxes. These people are elites because they have certain psychological traits. Either they are strong, right, in your physical strength wise, or they are diplomatically or mind wise they are very cunning, agile, diplomatic. So those two people, there is a transfer or there is a cycle of power, transfer of power. Pareto says history is history is the graveyard of aristocracy. He talks about circulation of elite. Now this point is very different from Mosca. Mosca says yes, there are certain traits, but it's not common for all the societies. And you cannot clump all types of democratic, socialist, communist society into elite rule. They have different traits. And according to Mosca, in a democratic society, there is a chances of getting recruited to be an elite from a wider range of population, not just lions and foxes. Then comes Robert Michaels, iron law of oligarchy. Right? That even if it is democracy, your oligarchy rule will always be there. Few people will occupy the topmost position. Now, he never talks about what are the traits of these people. He never talks about what society to society, how elite differs. He just gives a rule that come what may, there will be iron law of elites. He does talk about elite unity and dominance, but never what are the traits of elite people. So these are the differences. So you draw a table for differences, similarities. You can give in 1, 2 lines. You can talk about, or you can just give headings with respect to similarities, and your answer is done. Right? Discuss their main and crucial issues. So there is a second part also, where you have to criticize the issue with each theory. Right? That you write in the second part. So practically this question has 3 parts: differences, similarities, and criticism of each theory. 3 parts. So read the question carefully. Right? Okay, next is critically analyze sociological significance of informal sector in economies of developing societies. Now first you have to define informal economy and its feature. It is given by a thinker, Keith Hart. It is very important. His name should always be included. Now they are asking informal sector in developing society. You can talk about India, Bangladesh, or any developing society. What is the significance, sociological significance? So how do you write sociological significance? Take 1 minute and think about it. Now this question is applied based. They've not asked about informal economy. They've asked what is the significance of informal economies in developing societies. Not all society, developing. Take 2 minutes and think about it. Everyone, just think what is the significance and which parameters you will discuss the informal economy. Yes, anyone? Around which angles you will discuss the sociological significance? Yes? One I gave you a few minutes back only. Gender. Mostly women, because these are low paying jobs. So mostly in developing country, these are a source of income and freedom for women. They are being exploited. That's a different issue that you will write in criticism. Right? What else? Sociological significance of informal society. Sorry? Little louder. Gig economy. Okay. Sociological significance. Informal economy, one part is your gig economy. What is its sociological significance? You can again write around gender angle. Work from home. Freelancers. It gives time for women to participate in gender roles, which are very important in developing societies. What else? Sorry? Migration, you can talk about with respect to urbanization. Urbanization in developing countries is an ongoing process, and here there is jobless growth, or mostly it is around IT sector. So major part of people who are migrating, who don't have skills, poor people, low caste, they are getting subsumed in informal economy. They don't have any other work, so they do work for this, right? Then in developing countries, this provides cheap source of labor also. All your food delivery apps, they are not a startup or a venture to be proud of. It's a symbol of kind of slavery only, telling a person to deliver you in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It is possible because there is cheap labor in India, right? So it is a source of cheap labor in developing countries. It's a source of income, and plus where labor laws are not properly implemented, informal economy in your developing countries, easy hire and fire, no need to give social security. The safety net is not there. And then you can write about social capital also. One person from a village, from a particular caste comes, then he refers his own kin members, caste members. So in developing economies, it's easy to recruit people. In the informal economy, it works by reference. Reference on the base of caste, reference on the base of kinship system. Right? So this you can write in this answer. Now next is, we'll just quickly cover in what way the scope of sociology is unique. Now this is again a simple question. You have to talk about what makes scope or the boundaries of sociology, how they are unique in nature, how it is different from probably other social sciences. So here you will discuss about the formal and synthetic school. You will then discuss how it covers society, social institutions, social processes, social interactions. So basically you have to make it clear that sociology is a different discipline. Its boundaries are unique and different from other social sciences. It's not psychology. It is not philosophy. It is not political science or history. It's a separate discipline which has its unique scope which it studies. Its boundaries are very unique, which is not studied by other discipline. Right? Again, very simple question in the first chapter itself. Then, does structural functionalist perspective on social stratification promote a status quo? Yes, obviously. So in this question, again, see, this is static question, this is again a static question. So, structural functionalist perspective on stratification. Now, there are two questions on stratification which have come. Previous one was, is it gender blind? And now there is again a question from stratification with respect to structural functionalist. So here you will describe Parsons' theory, right? How he talks about the social system and how he proposes a theory of change, right? And even if there is a change, it will be aimed at order and stability of the society. He talks about a mechanical equilibrium phase. He talks about moving equilibrium. So that stratification system Which structural functional perspective specifically Parsons talk about? It is based on value consensus. It is based on order and stability. It is based on social control. It is based on power differentials to ensure collective goals are achieved. So it promotes status quo. Status quo is whatever is there, same thing should remain. No change should be there. Then you can give a criticism, which I was explaining, that he does talk about a mechanical equilibrium phase, that there can be a change in the system and change of the system. When he talks about evolution, evolutionary universals. So it's not totally status quo. He did include certain part of social change in his theory, how the stratification system over the times might change. Right? So with this you conclude the answer. Next is, do you think the formal workspaces are free of gender bias? Yes, very easy question. Yes, are formal working space free of gender bias? Yes or no? Oh, wow. What are the points you will tell? Sorry? Gender pay gap, glass ceiling, sexual harassment at workplace, right? Pink collar jobs, give the concept of Sylvia Wolbe's public patriarchy, right? All these will tell that there is still gender bias present in the formal workplaces. Then very briefly you can tell that rules, laws have been formulated, right? Or you can give example that recently BCCI has approved that female and males will get same gender. So there is still, we are moving forward towards being gender bias free, but still there is a long journey to be there. And you end your answer, right? Again, easy question, static question. How does Weber's Versity address the objectivity and subjectivity debate in sociology? Again, this was just a question which they make little complex. So when we talk about Max Weber, he's seen as a bridge between the positivists and the non-positivists. Why? Because when you see his Versity, what are the points in Versity? 2 points. Yes, Versity. What are the two? Direct explanatory understanding and empathetic understanding. Direct explanatory and empathetic, they try to take a middle path, that you understand the feelings and motives of a person by being in a space, but also you focus on a cause and effect. Who does cause and effect? Positivists do a cause and effect. So his Versity concept was in the middle. I'll just show it to you. So Versity's concept, right? Its focus was on meaning and intention behind the action. So it recognized subjectivity, right? Empathetic yet systematic interpretation. So it ensures scientific rigor also, that you have to have a empathetic liaison with the actor, but also explanatory understanding. So it's in somewhere in the middle. Then explain social action in a context. That is one very important part of theory of social action. So it bridges the gap between objectivity and subjectivity. So through his concept of Versity, and that is why Marx is a link between positivism and non-positivism. He is trying to understand the subjective meanings and motives also, but at the same time, he wants to know the cause and effect. He wants to know the plurality of causes of something. He also wants to make a general theory also. So his concept of Versity, his methodology of Versity, tried to bridge this debate between objectivity and subjectivity, that both are important. This was a simple question. Instead of asking describe Versity, they just flipped the question, that how was it including both objectivity and subjectivity at the same time? How did this debate was solved by Weber's approach? right? So just read the question carefully. It's not that difficult to attempt questions. Then, to what extent education and skill development can be an agent of social change? For the students who are there in the foundation course, we'll do this tomorrow, right? But here you can add thinkers like Paulo Freire, who added that your education leads to critical thinking. Your education leads to voice to marginalized population. It increases your scientific temper, and through this, social change happens. There is an Indian thinker, M.S.A. Rao, who says education is a source of your social mobility. Social mobility means social change in the society, right? So these type of thinkers, where you can tell that how it can, education and skill development, it's a similar thing, can lead to social change. But you give the opposite part also, that how education can be an ideological apparatus, which is said by Louis Althusser. You can give the perspective by Ivan Illich also, where he talks that education system just produces robots. Same kind of thing. He stood for de-schooling of society. Schools should be ended. So you give an opposite perspective also, that education can stop social change also. When Durkheim talks about that education system is a way to pass on society's values and norms. So it means it is maintaining a status quo. So both the paths should be there. How it is an agent of social change, how it is an agent of status quo. It stops the change from happening in the society, right? Then, what is science? Do you think methods used in natural sciences can be applied to sociology? This is a simple, direct question. Right? Define science, give the features of science, and you have to basically talk. Again, it's related to the positivism. Positivism uses scientific methods. There you have to describe that yes, it can be used, and no part also. So in your paper one, when we do is sociology a science or sociology cannot be a science, both those arguments will come here in this question, first chapter, right? Then, what do you understand by gender-based domestic division of labor? Is it undergoing a change in wake of increasing participation of women in formal employment? Clarify your answer. Now, another thing you should remember here is, there are two questions on gender now. This question and social stratification. So it means two questions are a lot. It's not a less number on one topic. So the gender component of anything, for informal economy, social stratification, paid, unpaid labor, patriarchal system, it's an important topic which UPSC might ask again. There will be certain topics which are repeated. Try to grasp those topics and do a proper preparation for them. So it is saying, what do you understand by gender-based domestic division of labor? Here you will talk about unpaid labor. If you go on channel, I have shared a video also where there is a estimation in dollars about how much work women's unpaid labor is worth. So you have to talk about this gender-based domestic labor, this unpaid labor where you do care work, household work. Right? This is your private patriarchy. Right? If it is a question about your outside world, like it was in is gender. So actually 3 questions on gender. One is social stratification gender blind? Second question was, are workplaces gender bias free? Third question is this. So 3 questions have come on gender. So it's a lot of weightage. Then you will write down the concept by Sylvia Wolby of private patriarchy. Right? You can also write the concept given by Shula Smith Firestone, that why this domestic division of labor came in the name of women. Right? Because for some period of time she was restricted to household. Then how religion justify this domestic division of labor. All these points you included here. Is it undergoing change in wake of participation? You write yes. You first include that there is a female labor force participation. In paper 2, we discuss about Karuna Ahmed, who talks about informal sector and women, and also talks about women participation in workforce. Give her points. Then the criticism part. Again, same thing, gender pay gap, glass ceiling, workplace harassment, right? So that in spite of increasing participation, there are certain issues, and also you connect that now women have a double shift. She was never excused from her gender-based domestic labor, just an added responsibility on her. And then you conclude the answer. Balanced answer is the key. Then next is, how can you assess the significance of social movement in digital era? See, again, social movements, what are the requirements for social movements? Ideology should be there. People's mobilization should be there. Awareness about the social movement. Resources should be there. Right? Social movements depend on these particular factors. Now, how digital era help in all these things, that you have to write down. Now here you can write down resource mobilization theory. Resource mobilization theory says success or failure of social movement depends on how well you can mobilize resources. Social media can mobilize resources in the best possible way. It can spread the message far off, right? And you can, at the start, you can write down that digital era has led to new social movements where there is larger base of participation. More awareness is there, right? So these concepts you write down in your social movement part, right? How the reach, awareness, identity formation, policy influence, how it is happening because of the digital era. And you write down different theories: resource mobilization theory, new social movement, reference group theory. Then you can also write down that through social media, now we live in a society which is known as risk society by Ulrich Beck. Risks are increasing and risks are common to all. And how did this information spreads? Through social media, through digital era. So now the social movements are not restricted to geographical boundary. They have expanded in nature because of the quality of risk society. So these questions along these lines you will write down. But at the end you write down challenges also. Spread of fake news, clickbaits, deep fakes, right? Involvement of terror states in spreading wrong information. That is a problem with social media protests. Okay, next is again sampling question is there, very simple question. Different types of sampling, random sampling, your collative sampling, all probability, non-probability sampling. It's a simple question, right? Nothing much to explain. The next question also, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. You have to explain the difference in their religion theory. Now the theories you know, but what will be the parameters of differences? Marx, Weber and Durkheim. First of all, religion, definition. How do they define religion? What is the cause of religion? What are the features of religion? What is the function of religion? In Marx, obviously, he says it's dysfunctional, right? It's a product or it's a tool of exploitation. Like this, you will discuss their theories in a tabular form, right? Yes, are we clear here? Religion theories are very simple for them. Then science and religion, again very easy, right? I'll share one table also on channel. In our foundation course, we just did this yesterday only. The nature of their area of study is different, research methods is different. One is based on your faith, belief, other is based on empiricism, observation. Right? So again, a table has to be drawn where you compare both of them. Then you can give thinker's perspective with respect to Stephen Jay Gould. He says religion and science have non-overlapping magisterial areas. No more. Richard Dawkins talks about how religion and science are totally at odds with each other. So two thinkers have come, table of differences have come. Lastly, you write down that some part of your religion, like Albert Einstein says that religion is, your science is lame without religion and religion is blind without science. Religion provides ethical, moral codes to science also. With this, a positive aspect, you close your answer. Right? Again, static question, direct question. Next three questions are, one is about sustainable development, one is civil society organization. This is again a direct question which we do in politics and society. And this last, queer kinship challenge. Both of them I'll share on the channel today, right? Just when the question is about kinship system, right? They are asking that how does queer kinship challenges the traditional kinship system? Now, how did the traditional kinship system look like? You should know that. Traditional kinship system was based on heterosexual norms. It was based on blood or affinal relations. It had gender-based division of labor. It had proper authority structure, mostly patriarchal and patrilineal in nature. So traditional kinship system used to look like this. Now, queer kinship system, homosexuals, gays, lesbian. Now for them these features are different. They might not have blood relations, their child might be adopted, right? Or they might be carrying the genes of only one parent. Other is the egg donor probably. So with respect to your queer kinship system, first of all, as Rosenthal says, heterosexual norms are depleting in nature, right? Queer kinship system, it validates same-sex partnership. It's no more heterosexual in nature. Then their families are more chosen families. This is a term used by Kat Weston. She says that when we're talking about queer community today, they're not related by blood. They're not related by marriage. They are the chosen families. In the event of any problems, financial problem, or there is a death in the family, these chosen families are with them. Right? There is a concept also. See, there was an epidemic of AIDS in 1990s. Right? Actually 80s, right? During that time, lot of the people who suffered from AIDS were gays, right? And at that point of time, there was no antiviral medicine also and the person who suffers from AIDS, he has a very painful death at the end, but it's not a communicable disease. During that time, because they were, disowned by their family, mostly the women from, mostly the lesbian women, they became more, regular in the hospitals. They used to take care of the gays who were suffering from AIDS. So it became like their chosen family, not a family by birth, but a family which you choose based on that we have a different sexual orientation. And you might know this fact when we use word LGBTQ. Previously, the term used to be GLBTQ. Only after this epidemic of AIDS, when lesbian women helped the gay AIDS patients, as a form of respect, L was put forward. And the term became LGBTQ, that during the time when they had no families, nobody to take care of them, lesbian families without any connection of marriage or blood, they helped the case. So this is a chosen family structure which is emerging. It is not related by blood or a female relationship. Gender-based division of labor is not there in queers. There are two fathers or two mothers. There are no two opposite people. So gender-based division is going. Authority structure is more equal in nature. Again, because the question of two gender is not there. So that is how the queer kinship system is very different from your traditional kinship system. So to answer this question, you should first know the features of traditional kinship system. And how, okay, if you don't know these thinkers, it's okay, now you know, I'll share this answer. But before that, at least you should be able to answer along these lines. Right? So this is about your paper 1. Key of all the answers I'll share in 1 week or 2 weeks time. It will be there on my channel. In case you are not on the channel, you can join this. ACE Sociology. So I'll share the entire key on this channel. You can refer to them. Tomorrow we will cover paper 2. Paper 2 also we will see. It's mostly static in nature. Right? So we'll continue from tomorrow. Thank you.